The rescue fleet that arrived at Nethys Prime 3 weeks later was the largest military force the Varrock Empire had assembled in over a century. Captain Vex Cole of the 23rd Assault Fleet brought 12 warships and 3,000 of their finest, warriors to deal with a single human who had turned their most sacred tradition into a nightmare. The High Command wanted Li Dongsu captured alive so they could make an example of him. But Captain Vex Cole was beginning to suspect that might not be possible. The orbital scans of the hunting preserve showed something that defied every tactical manual in their archives. Li had not simply survived in the jungle, he had transformed the entire continent into a fortress, using salvaged Varrock technology. And human engineering principles, he had created defensive systems that turned the preserve's natural features into weapons. Every river had been dammed and redirected, every mountain pass had been fortified, and every square kilometer of jungle had been turned into a killing field. The first landing parties found evidence of Li's work immediately. The original hunting camps had been stripped of everything useful, with the materials repurposed into traps and fortifications. The jungle paths that the Varrock had used for centuries now led into ambush zones where automated weapons fired salvaged energy blasts at anything that moved. The preserve that had been their playground had become a maze designed by someone who understood exactly how they thought and fought. Captain Vex Cole sent reconnaissance drones to map the new defensive positions, but they were systematically destroyed by weapons that should not have existed. Li had somehow learned to interface human tactical thinking, with Varrock technology creating hybrid systems that were more effective than either species had developed alone. The drones that managed to transmit data before being destroyed showed fortifications that would require months to assault properly, but the High Command was not interested in a prolonged siege. The rebellion that had started with Li's broadcast was spreading across the Empire. Conquered species were rising up using the tactical information he had provided to attack Varrock outposts and supply lines. The myth of Varrock invincibility was cracking, and every day that Li remained alive made the cracks wider. They needed him dead or captured immediately. The first assault wave consisted of 500 elite warriors supported by gunships and orbital bombardment. They approached the jungle fortress with overwhelming firepower, expecting to crush any resistance through sheer military superiority. But Li had spent a month studying captured Varrock equipment, and he knew exactly how their assault tactics worked. The trap he had prepared was devastating. The landing zones that looked safe from orbital reconnaissance were actually killing fields where concealed weapons could focus their fire. The jungle canopy that appeared to provide cover was rigged with explosives that turned trees into fragmentation bombs. The streams and rivers that the assault force used for navigation led directly into prepared ambush positions. The battle lasted 18 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the Varrock landing force. 500 elite warriors, veterans of the conquest campaigns, were systematically eliminated by traps, ambushes, and tactics that seemed to anticipate their every move. Li had become something beyond their understanding, not just a warrior, but a force of nature that turned their own strength against them. Captain Vex Cole watched the tactical feeds in growing horror as his assault force was picked apart by an enemy that refused to fight according to accepted rules. The human used psychological warfare, targeting officers first to break command structures. He employed impossible logistics, somehow keeping his defensive systems supplied and operational across hundreds of square kilometers. And most disturbing of all, he seemed to be everywhere at once, striking at multiple locations simultaneously, as if he had learned to multiply himself. The second assault wave was larger, 800 warriors with heavy weapons and energy shields. But Li had used the 3-day interval to study the wreckage of the first attack. Every piece of Varrock equipment that survived the battle had been incorporated into his defensive network, making his weapons more powerful and his traps more sophisticated. The preserve had become a living laboratory where human creativity merged with alien technology. This time the battle lasted only 6 hours, The Varrock warriors found themselves fighting an enemy that knew their equipment better than they did. Their own weapons were used against them. Their communication frequencies were jammed by systems built from their salvaged parts, and their tactical doctrine was countered by someone who had spent weeks learning exactly how they would respond to every situation. The survivors of the second assault brought back reports that shattered the remaining confidence of the 23rd Fleet. The human was not just using Varrock technology, he was improving it, creating hybrid weapons that outperformed anything in their military inventory. He had turned the hunting preserve into a fortress that could probably withstand a full planetary invasion, and he was broadcasting tactical lessons to resistance movements across the galaxy. Captain Vex Cole found himself in an impossible position. The High Command demanded immediate results, but his forces were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that seemed to learn and adapt faster than they could respond. Every attack made Lee stronger, every failure made the rebellion grow, and every day that passed brought reports of new uprisings across the Empire. The final assault was a last desperate gamble. Vex Cole committed his entire remaining force, including himself, in a direct attack on what appeared to be Lee's command center. The location was obvious, a fortified position on the highest mountain peak surrounded by defensive works that could be seen from orbit. It was either the human's stronghold or the most elaborate trap in military history. Lee Dongsu was waiting for them, standing on the ramparts of his fortress like something out of an ancient legend. The human was no longer recognizable as the prisoner who had been brought to Nethys Prime weeks ago. He wore armor crafted from Varrock. Materials carried weapons that hummed with hybrid technology and moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had transcended the limitations of his species. The battle was brief and decisive. Captain Vex Cole and his remaining warriors charged up the mountain into a killing field that had been months in preparation. Every step of their approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. Every piece of cover concealed another trap, and every tactical option led to the same inevitable conclusion. They were fighting an enemy who had used their own hubris to forge himself into the perfect weapon for their destruction. When the shooting stopped, Lee stood alone among the bodies of the last Varrock assault force. The 23rd Fleet was destroyed. A hunting preserve was his. And across the galaxy, conquered species were rising up with the knowledge that their oppressors could be beaten. The great hunt was over, but it had ended very differently than anyone had expected Lee's final broadcast to. The galaxy was brief and to the point. The Varrock Empire thought they were the ultimate predators, but they made one mistake. They hunted humans. Now they know what it feels like to be prey. The coordinates of every Varrock hunting preserve, every military outpost, and every weakness in their defenses are being transmitted on all frequencies. The message ended with a simple declaration: the hunt is over. The Varrock are finished. Anyone who wants to learn how to kill the unkillable can find me here. I will teach anyone who comes what I learned about turning predators into prey. Within a year, the Varrock Empire had collapsed not through military conquest, but through the systematic elimination of their warrior caste species that had been prey for millennia. Became hunters, using the lessons Lee had taught them to track down every Varrock outpost, every hunting party, and every reminder of the empire that had terrorized the galaxy. Lee Dongsu became a legend, not as a human warrior, but as the teacher who had shown the galaxy that no predator was truly invincible. The hunting preserve of Nethys Prime became a pilgrimage site where representatives of freed species came to learn the tactics that had brought down the greatest military empire in Galactic history. The last of the Varrock died as they had lived, being hunted for sport. But this time, the hunters. The emergency shelter was supposed to be impregnable. Built from advanced Varrock alloys and powered by a fusion cell that could run for months, the fortified position should have been able to withstand anything the jungle could throw at it. But Lee Dongsu was no longer just another jungle predator. He had become something that the Varrock military had never planned for a human who understood their technology better than they understood his capabilities. Squad leader Thek Moore and his 3 remaining hunters had barricaded themselves inside the shelter after finding the mutilated remains of Cormel. The psychological warfare was working. Lee could hear it in their voices when they tried to coordinate their defense. They were scared warriors who had conquered 17 star systems, reduced to cowering behind walls like frightened children. The first mistake they made was calling for extraction. Thekmore sent desperate messages to the orbital command ship begging for immediate evacuation. But Commander Kralvos had his orders from the High Command. No Varrock hunter had ever retreated from a great hunt, and they would not start now. The Empire's reputation was built on the myth of Varrock invincibility, and that myth could not be allowed. Lee listened to their communications from his position in the trees above the shelter. He had learned enough of their language during the past week to understand the growing panic in their voices. They were trapped between a human who refused to die and a command structure that refused to let them live. The perfect tactical situation from Lee's perspective. Hunter Zeknal was the first to break completely. The young warrior had been boasting about his kills just a week ago, but now he sat in the corner of the shelter, rocking back and forth and muttering prayers to Varrock gods. Lee could see him through the thermal imaging scope he had salvaged from one of the dead hunters. The alien's body heat signature showed the classic signs of psychological collapse. When Zeknal finally made his desperate run for the backup communication array, Lee was ready. The crossbow he had constructed from salvaged materials was crude, but effective. The bolt took the fleeing hunter in the spine. Dropping him 30 meters from the shelter, Lee allowed him to live long enough to crawl back toward his companions before the second bolt finished the job. The remaining 3 hunters watched their comrade die just outside their supposed safe. Haven Thekmore tried to retrieve the body, but Lee had positioned himself to cover all approaches to the fallen warrior. The squad leader was forced to watch as something began feeding on Zeknal's corpse. The jungle predators had learned that dead Varrock meant easy meals. 2 days passed with the hunters trapped in their shelter. Lee spent the time studying their defensive systems, learning how their power grid worked, how their sensors operated, how their life support functioned. The Varrock had built their fortress to keep jungle animals out, but they had never considered that their enemy might be a trained saboteur who understood technology. The power failures began on the 3rd day, small cascading problems that seemed like random malfunctions, but were actually carefully orchestrated attacks on their infrastructure. Lee had learned enough about their systems to create failures that would look accidental. The lights flickered. The air recycling system developed strange noises, and the external sensors began showing false readings. Hunter Nelke volunteered to go outside and check the backup generators. She was a veteran of 30 successful hunts, and she moved with professional caution, but Lee had spent days preparing for this moment. The trap was simple but lethal. A focused energy discharge from their own power systems turned into a weapon. The explosion lit up the jungle like a miniature sun. Thekmore and Hunter Thek were alone now, facing an enemy who had systematically eliminated 10 of the Empire's finest warriors. The squad leader tried to maintain discipline, but Thek was showing signs of the same psychological breakdown that had claimed Zeknal. The constant stress of being hunted was breaking down warriors who had seemed unbreakable. Lee began his final assault that night using techniques he had learned during urban warfare training on Mars. The shelter's defenses were designed to repel direct attacks, but they were vulnerable to infiltration. Lee had found the maintenance shafts, the emergency exits, the weak points that every structure possessed no matter how advanced. The lights went out at midnight, plunging the shelter into darkness. The emergency power should have activated immediately, but Lee had spent 2 days sabotaging the backup systems. The two remaining hunters found themselves trapped in absolute blackness with something that had learned to see them as clearly as they once saw him. Morthek died in the darkness, his 4 arms. No match for a human who had memorized every weakness in Varrock anatomy, Lee struck from behind, using a blade forged from their own advanced materials. The alien warrior's death scream echoed through the shelter before being cut short by steel sliding. Between vertebrae squad leader. Thekmor was alone now, the last survivor of the greatest hunting party in Varrock history. He activated his personal shield and tried to make a stand in the shelter's main room. His weapons swept the darkness looking for a target. But Lee was everywhere and nowhere, moving through the facility like a ghost. When the emergency lighting finally came back on, Thekmor saw Lee Dong-su standing in the doorway. The human was covered in alien blood and carrying weapons. That should not have existed, a fusion of Varrock technology and human ingenuity that created tools of destruction beyond anything in their military manuals. Lee no longer looked like the desperate prisoner who had been brought to Nethys Prime. His eyes held a coldness that spoke of calculated violence. His movements had the fluid precision of a predator at the peak of its evolution. He had become something beyond the understanding of creatures who thought conquest was just another game. "You wanted to hunt a human for sport," Lee said, his voice calm despite the carnage around him. "Now you get to be the first Varrock to learn what that really means." Thekmor raised his weapons, but he knew it was useless. The human had already won, not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through something the Varrock had forgotten in their millennia of easy conquest. The willingness to become more savage than those who threatened you. The ability to adapt and overcome no matter what the cost. The great hunt was over. But as Thekmor looked into those cold human eyes, he realized that something much worse was about to begin. The Varrock Empire had created their own nemesis, and Lee Dong-su was just getting started, the galaxy's greatest. Predators were about to learn what it meant to be hunted to extinction. Squad leader. Thekmor's interrogation lasted 3 days, and it was not pleasant. Lee Dong-su needed information about the Varrock Empire fleet positions, communication codes, the locations of other hunting preserves, and the names of every species they had driven to extinction. The alien warrior held out longer than expected, his military conditioning designed to resist torture, but Lee had learned techniques during his years in special operations that could break even the strongest minds on. The first day, Lee used psychological pressure, playing recordings of his dead comrades' final screams and showing him images of their mutilated bodies. The Varrock were proud warriors, but they were not used to being helpless. The constant threat of violence without actual physical harm created a stress response that began wearing down Thekmor's resistance. The second day brought physical persuasion. Lee had studied Varrock anatomy during his week of hunting their warriors, and he knew exactly where to apply pressure to cause maximum pain without permanent damage. The alien's 4 arms made him different from humans, but pain was universal, and Lee had become an expert at using it as a tool. By the 3rd day, Thekmor was broken telling Lee everything he wanted to know about the Empire's structure. The Varrock had conquered 17 star systems by systematically eliminating the military elites of each species. They would arrive, study the local warriors, and then hunt the best of them to extinction, leaving the remaining population demoralized and easy to control. The High Command operated from a massive fortress ship called the Eternal Dominion, which moved from system to system, overseeing the hunting expeditions. There were 12 hunting preserves scattered across Varrock space, each one containing warriors from different species who were being slowly eliminated for sport. The entire empire was built on the idea that they were the ultimate predators in the galaxy. Lee learned about the betting pools among the noble houses, how they wagered on which hunters would make the most kills, how long prey would last, and what creative methods would be used to eliminate them. The Great Hunt was not just military training. It was entertainment for an entire civilization that had forgotten what it meant to struggle for survival. Most importantly, Lee learned about the communication networks that connected the Empire. The Varrock used quantum entanglement transmitters that could send messages instantaneously across vast distances. The technology was beyond human understanding, but the codes and protocols were just information that could be stolen and used. When Thekmor finally died, Lee had everything he needed. The squad leader's final words were a warning that the Empire would send fleets to avenge their fallen hunters, but Lee was counting on exactly that response. The Varrock had built their reputation on being unstoppable, and he was about to prove that. Reputation was a lie. The orbital command ship, Destructor's Pride, received Thekmor's final transmission exactly as Lee intended. Commander Kralvos and his bridge crew watched in horror as their greatest hunters were systematically dismantled by something that refused to accept its place in the galactic food chain. The human stood over the squad leader's body, speaking directly into the camera with words that would echo through the Empire for generations. "You made a mistake when you chose to hunt humans," Lee said, looking directly at the camera, his voice carrying the cold certainty of absolute conviction. "We are not like the other species you have conquered. We do not break when you kill our warriors. We do not surrender when you make us your enemy. We become something worse than your nightmares." He gestured to the bodies of the 12 hunters scattered around the shelter, each one arranged to show the methodical nature of their deaths. "This is what happens when you hunt humans for sport. Every one of your warriors who died here taught me something new about how to kill Varrock. I know your weaknesses now. I know your technology. I know your tactics." The camera focused on Lee's face, and Commander Kralvos could see something in those human eyes that made his blood run cold. This was not the desperate fear they usually saw in their prey. This was the calculating gaze of a predator that had found new hunting grounds. "You wanted to test yourselves against human warriors," Lee continued. "Well, congratulations. You passed the test. You have successfully created your own destruction. Every species you have hunted to extinction is about to get their revenge. Because I am going to teach the galaxy everything I learned about." Hunting Varrock Lee activated the Hunting Preserve's emergency beacon, but not for rescue. The signal would broadcast on all frequencies, reaching every enslaved world in the Empire. The message was simple and devastating. The mighty Varrock hunters had been beaten by a single human soldier, and that human was now declaring war on their entire civilization. The transmission continued for 10 minutes, with Lee providing detailed information about Varrock, weaknesses, their technology, their military structure, and, most importantly, their fear. He spoke directly to the conquered species, telling them that their oppressors were not gods. They bled, they died, and they could be beaten by anyone willing to pay the price in blood and determination. Word spread through the underground networks that connected resistance movements across 17 star systems. The impossible had happened. Someone had not just survived the Great Hunt, but had turned it into a demonstration of Varrock vulnerability. Prison camps erupted in riots, slave worlds began organizing rebellions, and in the deepest parts of space, creatures that had been hiding from Varrock hunters began planning their own hunting expeditions. Commander Kralvos stared at the tactical display showing 12 red icons where his hunters should have been. The human had not just killed them, he had turned their deaths into a weapon that could destroy the Empire. The High Command would demand explanations, but how could he explain that their most sacred tradition had been perverted into enemy propaganda? The betting pools were closed, the noble houses were in emergency session, and reports were coming in from across the empire of uprisings and attacks on Varrock outposts. The conquered species were no longer accepting their fate as prey. They had seen that the hunters could be hunted, and they wanted to learn how Lee's final words to the camera would be played on rebel broadcasts for years to come. The Varrock Empire built its power on fear. But fear works both ways. You spent thousands of years teaching the galaxy to be afraid of you. Now I am going to teach you what it feels like to be afraid. And when I am done with you, the only place anyone will remember the Varrock is in stories. Parents tell their children about monsters that used to exist. The transmission ended with coordinates not for rescue but for revolution. The hunting preserve of Nethys Prime had become the epicenter of a galactic uprising as species that had been prey for millennia finally understood that their predators were not invincible. The Great Hunt was over, but the real war was just beginning, and Li Dong-su was about to teach the galaxy what it meant to hunt monsters to extinction. 3 days had passed since the hunt began, and 5 of the 12 Varrock hunters were dead. Li Dong-su had become something the alien warriors had never encountered before, a prey that hunted back. Each death had taught him more about their technology, their tactics, and most importantly, their psychology. The mighty Varrock Empire was learning what it meant to fear. The second hunter to die was Morketh, who made the mistake of pursuing Li alone through a maze of fallen trees. Li had spent hours preparing the trap using vines to create a snare that would catch even a creature with 4 arms. The Varrock hunter died slowly enough for Li to study his equipment and learn how their weapons worked. Knowledge was just another weapon, and Li collected it like ammunition. Squad leader Thek Moore found Morketh's body arranged in a pattern that spoke of cold calculation rather than desperate struggle. The human had taken time to study the corpse to understand Varrock anatomy and physiology. Thek Moore had killed warriors from dozens of species, but none of them had ever done anything like this. They fought with rage or fear or desperation, but this human fought with the methodical precision of a scientist. The third and fourth hunters died together, caught in an avalanche of rocks that Li had triggered from above. Hunter Vexnal and Hunter Corthes were veterans of 50 successful hunts, but they had never faced an enemy who could turn the jungle itself into a weapon Li watched from concealment. As their bodies were crushed, then moved in to salvage what equipment he could use. By the 4th day, the remaining hunters had abandoned their original formation. They moved in tight groups of 3 or 4, never separating, never pursuing alone. But Li had anticipated this change. He had spent years fighting insurgents who adapted to his tactics, and he knew how to stay one step ahead. The Varrock were learning, but they were learning too slowly. Huntress Vex Carr was the most dangerous of the remaining hunters. She wore her necklace of bone trophies like a badge of honor, and she moved through the jungle with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. She commanded the remaining 7 hunters with tactical skill that impressed, even Li. But confidence could become overconfidence, and Li knew how to exploit that weakness. The trap he set for Vex Carr was his most elaborate yet. A false camp near a water source complete with signs of hasty abandonment and a trail leading away into thick undergrowth. Li knew the hunters would approach carefully, but their caution would work against them. They would focus on the obvious trail and miss the real danger. Vex Carr approached the abandoned camp exactly as Li had predicted. She sent 2 hunters to check the area while she studied the trail with her scanning equipment. The other 4 hunters formed a perimeter watching for ambush, but they were watching the wrong direction. Li struck from above, dropping from the canopy, like a falling shadow. The alien huntress was fast, but Li was faster. The knife he had taken from Morketh slid between the plates of her natural armor, finding the soft tissue beneath Vex Carr, tried to bring her weapons to bear. But Li was already moving, rolling away from her dying grasp and disappearing back into the trees. Her bone necklace scattered across the jungle floor, trophies of 100 kills now meaningless. The 6 remaining hunters found their leader's body an hour later and, for the first time in the history of the Great Hunt, panic began to set in. These were the elite of the Varrock military warriors who had conquered star systems, but they were being systematically eliminated by something they had dismissed as primitive: prey. Their communications back to the orbital command ship grew increasingly desperate. Commander Kral Voss watched the hunt feeds from orbit with growing disbelief. The human was not just surviving, he was thriving. Each engagement showed tactical sophistication that surpassed their own military academies. The betting pools among the noble houses had closed after the third hunter died. Some were quietly suggesting that perhaps this hunt should be ended before it became an embarrassment to the Empire. But Li Dongsu was just getting started. He had learned enough about Varrock technology to understand their weaknesses. Their energy weapons were powerful, but they needed clear lines of sight. Their armor was strong, but it had joints and gaps. Their scanning equipment could track heat and movement, but it could be fooled by someone who understood how it worked. The fifth hunter to die was Nelvos, who tried to ambush Li near a grove of the glowing trees the Varrock warrior had positioned, himself perfectly using his natural camouflage to blend with the alien vegetation. But Li had been watching him for 2 hours, learning his patterns, his breathing, his tiny, unconscious movements. When Nelvos finally tried to strike, Li was not there anymore. Li appeared behind the hunter like a nightmare made flesh. The captured Varrock weapon in his hands hummed with deadly energy. Nelvos spun around his 4 arms, moving with inhuman speed, but the plasma bolt caught him center mass, burning through his natural armor like paper. The smell of cooked flesh filled the jungle air as another of the galaxy's greatest hunters learned what it meant to be outmatched. Hunter Kekmore died trying to reach the emergency beacon that would summon Extraction. He made it within 10 meters of the device before Li's trap claimed him, a deadfall of sharpened stakes that turned the beacon into a killing field. The remaining 4 hunters found his body impaled like an insect in a collection. There, communications back to orbit grew more frantic with each passing hour. Kekmore was down to 4 hunters, including himself, and for the first time in his long career, he was seriously considering retreat. The human had turned their sacred hunt into a nightmare of guerrilla warfare using tactics that seemed to anticipate their every move. But retreat was not an option. The High Command had made it clear that failure was not acceptable. The 6th hunter died that night. Cormel was on watch duty. When Li struck, the human had learned to move without triggering their motion sensors, to approach from angles their technology could not cover. Cormel's throat was cut before he could raise an alarm. His body left where the others would find it. In the morning, another message that their prey had become their predator. 3 hunters remained, plus squad leader Kekmore, and they were no longer the confident warriors who had entered the jungle a week ago. They jumped at shadows, fired at movement. That turned out to be wind-blown leaves. Their advanced weapons and superior numbers meant nothing against an enemy who refused to fight by their rules. Li watched them from concealment, studying their deteriorating discipline. Their formation was tighter now, but that just made them a better target. Their communication was constant, but it revealed their positions. Their technology was impressive, but it had made them dependent on tools instead of instincts, and Li Dongsu had spent 15 years learning to trust his instincts above everything else. The Great Hunt was supposed to last 6 days at most, but Li had already survived a week, and he was not running anymore. He was hunting, and the remaining Varrock warriors were beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake when they chose to hunt a human for sport. The galaxy's greatest predators were about to learn what it meant to be prey. The transport ship carrying Li Dongsu through space was like nothing he had ever seen. The walls seemed to be made of living metal that shifted and pulsed with its own light. Strange symbols covered every surface, glowing with colors that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The Varrock guards watched him constantly, but they seemed relaxed, almost bored, as if transporting doomed prisoners was just another routine task. Li spent the 3-day journey studying everything he could see. The guards carried weapons that looked like they were grown rather than built. The metal of the ship responded to their touch-opening doors and activating controls without any visible buttons or switches. This was technology thousands of years ahead of anything humans had developed. But Lee had learned long ago that advanced did not always mean better. When they reached Nethys Prime, Lee got his first look at the hunting preserve through a small window. The planet was covered in jungle so thick that he could not see the ground from orbit. 3 moons hung in the purple sky, casting strange shadows across the endless canopy of alien trees. The air looked breathable, but everything else about the world screamed danger. Commander Kral Voss came to see him before the landing. The alien commander seemed excited like a hunter on the morning of a big game expedition. Lee could see other Varrock through the corridors, now dozens of them all watching him with those yellow eyes. Some were placing bets on how long he would last. You should feel honored, human. Kral Voss said, "The 12 hunters who will pursue you are legends in our empire." Squad leader. Thekmor has killed over 300 warriors from 17 different species. Huntress Vexkar wears a necklace made from the bones of her greatest kills. Hunter Klex Von once tracked a Rigelian phase shifter for 8 days through a radioactive wasteland. Lee said nothing, but he memorized every name, every detail. The alien was giving him intelligence. Without realizing it, information about his enemies that might keep him alive for a few extra hours. The landing bay of Nethys Prime was carved into a mountain overlooking the jungle. The air was hot and humid with a smell like rotting flowers mixed with ozone. Strange insects buzzed through the air, some of them as large as his fist, with wings that sparked with electricity. The gravity was slightly heavier than Earth, making every step feel like he was carrying a heavy pack. They stripped him of everything except basic survival gear, a simple knife, a water purifier, some emergency rations and clothing that would protect him from the worst of the jungle. A Varrock technician scanned him with some kind of device to make sure he was not hiding. Any advanced equipment? They were thorough, but they missed the most important thing. Lee carried his training. "You have 1 hour before the hunt begins," Kral Voss announced. "The jungle extends for thousands of kilometers in every direction. There is no escape except through death or victory. 12 of our greatest hunters will pursue you using every advantage we possess. May your death bring honor to your species." Lee stepped onto the jungle floor and felt the soft earth give way under his boots. The canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a twilight world of shadows and glowing plants. The sounds were alien but familiar. The buzz of insects, the calls of unseen animals, the rustle of wind through leaves. Every jungle had its own rhythm, and Lee had learned to read them all. He moved quickly at first, putting distance between himself and the landing site. The Varrock would expect him to run in panic, to crash through the undergrowth, leaving an easy trail to follow. But Lee had spent years in jungles on 3 different worlds, and he knew how to move without leaving sign. He stepped on rocks whenever possible, avoided breaking branches, and chose paths that would confuse anyone trying to track him. The first lesson of survival was to know your enemy. Lee had listened carefully to everything the Varrock had told him. They were proud hunters who had never failed to catch their prey. They used advanced technology, but they also relied on their natural advantages: size, strength, and 4 arms that could wield multiple weapons. They would be confident, maybe overconfident. After 30 minutes, Lee found what he was looking for. A stream running through a deep ravine. The water was clear and cold, flowing over rocks, worn smooth by centuries of current. He followed the stream for half a kilometer, then climbed out on the far side, using a fallen tree to avoid leaving footprints on the bank. The second lesson was to use the terrain. The jungle was full of dangers, but it was also full of opportunities. Every poisonous plant was a potential weapon. Every hidden cave was a place to rest. Every cliff was a trap waiting to be sprung. The Varrock might have superior technology, but this was Lee's kind of battlefield. Found a good hiding spot in a tangle of vines, near a game trail. Animals had worn a clear path through the jungle, which meant the Varrock hunters would probably use it too. Lee spent his remaining time preparing a simple trap. Nothing fancy, just a sharpened stick positioned where someone following the trail might step. The point was not to kill, but to slow them down to make them cautious. When his hour was up, Lee heard the hunters enter the jungle. They made no attempt at stealth crashing, through the undergrowth like they owned the place. He could hear them calling to each other in their own language, coordinating their search. They had divided into 4 groups of 3 hunters each, trying to cover as much ground as possible. The first group found his false trail within an hour. They followed the obvious signs he had left, leading away from the stream while Lee watched from concealment 50 meters away. The Varrock moved fast, but they were noisy, talking constantly and using their technology to scan for traces of his passage. They found the trap he had left at the stream, and one of them actually laughed. "Look at this crude thing," Hunter Klex Vaughn said in accented English, "a sharpened stick like something a primitive would make. This human thinks he can fight us with Stone Age weapons." The 3 hunters crossed the stream without checking for other traps. They were following his false trail deeper into the jungle exactly as Lee had hoped, but they had made a mistake by underestimating. Him and Lee had learned long ago that underestimating your enemy was often fatal. He followed them, moving through the trees like a shadow. The Varrock were focused on the trail ahead, not watching for pursuit. Their natural armor made them confident. But armor always had weak points, joints, and gaps where a blade could find flesh. Lee had spent years learning anatomy, both human and alien, and he knew where to strike. The opportunity came when they stopped to consult some kind of tracking device. Klex Vaughn was bent over the instrument, while his 2 companions scanned the area ahead. Lee moved like a ghost, sliding between the trees until he was close enough to strike. The sharpened stick he had prepared was not the crude weapon they thought. It was but a precisely crafted tool, designed for one purpose. Klex Vaughn died without making a sound, the wooden point driven up through the gap in his helmet into his brain. Lee was already moving before the body hit the ground, rolling away from the other 2 hunters as they spun around trying to find their attacker. Their weapons blazed, cutting down trees and melting rocks, but Lee was already gone, vanished into the jungle like smoke. The remaining 2 hunters found their companion's body, and for the first time, Lee heard something in their voices that had not been there before: uncertainty. They called for the other hunting groups, their confident laughter replaced by sharp commands. The great hunt had begun, but already the rules were changing Lee. Dongsu smiled as he disappeared deeper into the jungle. The Varrock had wanted to hunt a human for sport, but they had chosen the wrong prey. Lee was not running, scared through the wilderness. He was hunting them, and he had just taught the galaxy's greatest predators their first lesson in what it meant to be afraid. Captain Lee Dongsu wiped the sweat from his forehead as he checked his rifle for the last time. The jungle moon of Kepler 442c was finally quiet after 3 months of hunting down rebel forces who had been attacking human supply convoys. The air was thick and hot, making every breath feel like drinking soup, but Lee had grown used to worse conditions during his 15 years as a Green Beret. The mission was almost over. Just one more sweep through the northern sector, and he could return to base. The rebels had been using the dense jungle to hide their camps, but Lee had tracked down their leader 2 days ago. Now the remaining fighters were scattered and running scared. Exactly how he liked his enemies. Lee moved through the jungle, like a ghost, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. His dark eyes scanned every shadow, every movement of the alien plants that glowed with soft blue light in the perpetual twilight under the canopy. Something felt wrong, though. The jungle was too quiet even for a place where most of the dangerous animals had learned to fear the sound of human weapons. Then he heard it, a low humming sound that made his teeth ache. The sound was coming from above, getting louder every second. Lee looked up through the gaps in the canopy and saw something that made his blood turn cold. 3 massive ships were descending through the atmosphere, their hulls gleaming like polished silver in the pale sunlight. The ships were unlike anything in the human fleet. They moved with perfect silence except for that bone-deep humming, and they were huge. Each one easily the size of a city block. Lee had never seen alien technology before, but he knew that was exactly what he was looking at. His hand moved to his radio, but before he could call for backup, the world exploded into chaos. Beams of red light lanced down from the ships, turning trees into ash and melting rocks into glass. Lee rolled behind a fallen log as the jungle around him became a hellscape of fire and destruction. The aliens were not trying to kill him, though they were hurting him, driving him toward a clearing where one of their ships was landing. Lee ran through the burning jungle, his training taking over as his mind calculated distances. And cover, the aliens had plasma weapons and energy shields, but they still had to follow basic tactical principles. He could use the terrain, work his way around their flanks, and maybe find a way to call for help. But as he reached the edge of the clearing, Lee realized how wrong he was. 12 figures emerged from the landed ship, and they were not like anything he had imagined. Aliens in movies were usually small and weak, but these creatures stood nearly 8 feet tall with 4 arms that ended in claws like knives. Their skin looked like natural armor with plates of bone covering their chests and backs. The leader stepped forward, and Lee could see intelligence in its yellow eyes. This was not some mindless monster, but a thinking enemy that had planned this attack. The creature raised one of its 4 hands and spoke in perfect English, its voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. "My name is Commander Kral Vos of the Varrock Empire. We have traveled far to find you, Captain Lee Dong-Su. Your reputation precedes you. 47 kills in the Centauri campaign, 63 confirmed eliminations during the Jupiter Rebellion. You are exactly what we have been searching for." Lee kept his rifle trained on the alien commander, but he knew he was outnumbered. The other 11 creatures had spread out in a perfect tactical formation, their own weapons aimed at him. Any one of them could kill him before he could fire a second shot. "How do you know my name?" Lee asked, his voice steady, despite the impossible situation. "The Varrock have been watching your species for some time," Commander Kral Vos replied. "We are collectors of sorts. We travel the galaxy finding the greatest warriors of each species and testing ourselves against them. Your human military records speak of something called special forces, soldiers who can accomplish impossible missions. We have come to see if the stories are true." The alien commander gestured to his soldiers, and they began to advance. Lee fired, his rifle putting 3 rounds center mass into the nearest Varrock. The bullets sparked off its natural armor, doing no visible damage. The creature did not even slow down. Lee rolled to his left as energy blasts turned the ground where he had been, standing into molten glass. He came up firing again, aiming for the gaps in their armor, but there were too many of them. They moved with practiced coordination, cutting off every escape route, forcing him back toward the center of the clearing. One of the Varrock soldiers reached him before he could reload, its massive hand closing around his throat and lifting him off the ground. Lee drove his combat knife into the creature's wrist, but the blade barely scratched its armored skin. The alien looked at the knife with what might have been amusement before backhanding Lee across the clearing. Lee hit the ground hard, his rifle spinning away into the brush. Blood filled his mouth and his vision blurred, but he forced himself to stand. The Varrock were advancing slowly now, taking their time like predators who knew their prey was trapped. "You fight well for such a small creature," Commander Kral Vos observed. "Your species shows promise. This is why you have been chosen for a great honor. You will participate in the great hunt on Nethys Prime, the great hunt." Lee spat blood onto the ground. "What is that supposed to mean?" The Varrock commander smiled, showing teeth like broken glass. For 10,000 years, my people have been the greatest hunters in the galaxy. We have conquered 17 star systems, not through mere warfare, but by proving our superiority over every species we encounter. The Great Hunt is our most sacred tradition. Lee tried to edge toward his fallen rifle, but two of the Varrock soldiers blocked his path. Their yellow eyes never left him, and he could see they were enjoying this. They had done this before, many times. Every species produces warriors who believe themselves unbeatable, the commander continued. The Centaurian, berserkers, who could tear through steel with their bare hands. The Andromedan shadow fighters, who could become invisible at will. The crystal-born of Vega, who could survive in the vacuum of space. We hunted them all to extinction. The words hit Lee, like a physical blow. These aliens had not just conquered other species, they had systematically eliminated their best fighters one by one, turning war into some kind of sick game. Now it is humanity's turn. Kralvoss said, "You will be taken to Nethys Prime, our greatest hunting preserve. There you will be given basic survival equipment and a 1-hour head start. Then 12 of our finest hunters will pursue you through the jungle. Most prey lasts 3 to 4 days before we catch them. The record is 6 days set by a Rigelian shock trooper who managed to kill 2 of our hunters before he died." Lee felt rage building in his chest, but he forced it down. Anger would get him killed, and he needed to stay alive long enough to find a way out of this nightmare. "What makes you think I will run?" Lee asked. "Why should I play your game?" "Because the alternative is immediate death," the commander replied. "At least in the Great Hunt, you have a chance, however small, to survive. And if you do manage to kill all 12 hunters, something that has never happened in our history, you will be freed." Lee looked around the clearing at the 12 alien warriors studying their equipment, their formation, their apparent confidence. They moved like soldiers, who had never lost a battle, who had never even been seriously challenged. He was just one human with basic equipment against creatures that had been hunting and killing for thousands of years. But Lee Dong-soo had not survived 15 years of special operations by accepting impossible odds. He had learned long ago that every enemy had weaknesses. Every tactical situation had solutions that others could not see. These aliens thought they were taking him to his death, but they had no idea what a human soldier could accomplish when he had nothing left to lose. The Varrock soldiers surrounded him, forcing him toward their ship. Lee did not resist, but his mind was already working, calculating distances, studying their technology, looking for any advantage he could find. The Great Hunt had not started yet, but in his mind, Lee was already planning how to turn their game into his war. As the ship lifted off, carrying him toward an alien world where he was supposed to die, Lee Dong-soo smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. The Varrock Empire was about to learn why Earth had produced soldiers like him and why underestimating a human was the last mistake any enemy ever made.